Welcome. We're here for another podcast of Reformed Baptists on Mission. I'm John Divito, the Communications and Content Editor for Reformed Baptist Network, and I'm returning to have another discussion with one of our missionaries, Sam Masters, serving in Cordoba, Argentina. Sam was with us in a previous episode back in April where we looked at theological education and missions, but now we're returning to have another discussion that I'm excited about. It's something Sam Masters has spent a lot of time in his own studies and his own ministry benefiting from. And so it is looking at William Carey and his life and his ministry. So Sam, welcome back, brother.
Thank you, John. It's great to be back.
Now, as we consider William Carey, I assume many that are watching or listening to this are already aware of him, but maybe for those who aren't as familiar, can you sketch out a brief overview about his life, his ministry, and his ongoing impact in missions?
Sure. Well, as everybody knows, William Carey, some people refer to him as the father of modern missions. You start reading more technical literature, and there are people who will say, I'm not sure that that's the best thing to call him, that there were missionaries before that, and that's certainly true. William Carey was very aware of his predecessors, and there were many godly men who had been concerned about missions before William Carey kind of took up the baton. But I think it's a legitimate thing to call William Carey because the thing that William Carey did was really solve what I call the dilemma of means. Especially as Baptist churches, where we believe in the autonomy of the local church. We also believe in the importance of working together, of associations. But how do you structure missions so that independent, autonomous Baptist churches can go about the job of world mission? And that's kind of the question that he began to answer. And if we look at it all, there might be, and there are things in the actual methodology that we would say, well, that could be improved. But that's because we're so many years after that time, 250 years or more after he did it. So we can learn from his mistakes as well as from those things that he got right. But he was born in 1761 into a family that was very proud of their Anglican roots. He was born in the town of Pollersbury in the Midlands of England. He came to Christ as a young man, as an apprentice to a shoemaker, and but in that process became associated with a Baptist church in the town of Hackleston, and then the Lord worked in his life, and he sensed the call to ministry, and he pastored two churches in the Midlands near Northamptonshire, or in Northamptonshire, near Northampton, obviously, in Moulton, and he later pastored a larger church in the city of Leicester. But from early in his ministry, he sensed this strong sense of calling to the cause of missions. And it's a little bit of a mystery where that all comes from, because it was not something that was in the water at that time, not something that a lot of people were concerned about. But there was a great movement of God amongst the Baptist, the particular Baptist, the Reformed Baptist of Northamptonshire, and a lot of it under the influence of Jonathan Edwards. They were coming out of a period where hyper-Calvinism had done a lot of damage to the churches, and through Jonathan Edwards and others, reading authors such as Jonathan Edwards, they saw a real revival in their churches. And I think of it in terms of the Great Awakening finally catching up to the particular Baptist. And of course, part of the influence of Jonathan Edwards was the missions. Jonathan Edwards had been a missionary himself to the Indians in Massachusetts. And of course, he'd put together the book, on David Brainerd, and that book on David Brainerd had a huge impact on Carey and on others of his generation.
Yeah, Andrew Fuller is another well-known person that
absolutely
involved with all this.
And so Andrew Fuller, I think, is kind of the theologian of the movement, and I think you could make the case that William Carey really is just building on Fuller's theology. he takes Fuller's theology and they take it to the next level. Fuller dealt with the idea that the gospel should be offered freely. They recovered the free offer of the gospel, and then they put feet to that. They began preaching, offering the gospel, obviously from their pulpits, and then Andrew Fuller was very interested in evangelism, and they began doing village preaching. They would go to the next village where there wasn't a church, and the whole association became involved in this push to take the gospel to places where it wasn't being heard and to establish churches in those areas. And so I think the modern missionary movement grows out of that. And so William Carey has just taken the next logical step. If we're responsible to carry the gospel to the next village, why aren't we responsible to take it to those parts of the world where people have never heard? And so,
and of course,
he had a genius
that leads to him writing the classic work that has continued to
that's right,
continue to impact today.
The Inquiry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can never remember the name. The Inquiry into whether we should use means for the salvation of the heathen.
Something
that's not
like
exactly
that.
right,
yeah.
but that's the basic idea. One of those long titles that if you read the entire title, basically you got the idea of the book, because the answer to that question is yes.
Those old Puritan titles could be very lengthy, but give you a good summary of what they're going to write on, and of course the idea of going somewhere else in the world back then, it's different than today, not airplanes or whatever else. I mean, this is something, if you're making that kind of commitment, it's a life-changing, you're relocating potentially for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
In that.
All in.
And I know that, even in his personal life, some of the struggles he had with his wife going with him as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it was a major undertaking. He went out as a missionary they published the Inquiry in 1792, and then in 1793 he actually arrived in India. And so it was a very quick process. It had taken him years to bring his brethren around to the point of view that yes, we can and should do something. But once it began to happen, and God does this, often. Missionaries will find this happens. You're waiting and waiting, and then all of a sudden everything accelerates. And that's exactly what happened with Carey. They ended up on the field, and the first years of ministry in India were very, very difficult. The first 7-8 years from 1793 until 1800 were extremely difficult. Many of the biographies of Carey concentrate on that period. They ended up living they were impoverished, support hadn't arrived. They ended up living in the jungle. He had to build a homestead in the jungle. They suffered from illness. His wife during that period began to have significant emotional problems, mental instability. One of their children died of a fever, and it was just a very, very difficult time. And during that time, at the same time, he worked on a vernacular translation of the Bible into Bengali, a massive work, and also evangelized. He took that idea of village preaching. And at first they lived first they were in Calcutta, then they were in the Sundarbans, and then they moved north to the area of Malda. And all of this was, river country. And so he would go up and down the rivers in a boat, going to villages and basically doing the same things that he had done as part of the Northamptonshire Association in England. And so preaching, translating the scriptures, and during that time established the first Baptist church in India, and there were he had reached no Hindus at that point, but there was, for example, a man of mixed ancestry, of part Indian, part Portuguese. There were some British people, and so they began the first church that was ever begun in the Far East, the first Baptist church that was ever begun.
And I know that, as you said, it took many years for the first convert, many years. Eventually, due to, of course, the Lord's sovereign grace as well as Carey's faithfulness, you you do start to see fruit in that gospel ministry. But that even impacts how he has to think through the realities of the caste system and the other realities of Hindu and Indian culture during that time as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They ended up moving to in 1800. A new wave of missionaries arrived. There was actually 5 men who arrived in that group. Within about 2 years, half of the missionaries in India were dead from illness, but 3 missionaries stayed on, lived on, and so that was the famous Serampore trio: William Carey, William Ward, and Joshua Marshman. And those 3 worked together very, very effectively the rest of their lives, translated the scriptures into multiple languages, published the Bible in multiple languages, began a seminary, began a church planting process across India. And I really think that what they were trying to do was duplicate the associational life that they had experienced in England. If you look for what are their model, what are they aiming towards? It's not explicitly stated, but the results of it is about 10 years after Carey's death, the First Baptist Association is formed from the churches that they had started. And so it was all aiming towards that association with the idea that then they would, of course, they were training national preachers, they were training pastors, and they were moving towards an indigenous association. Some of that went astray in the next generation. But the model that they left us in that first generation, while not perfect, I think is a wonderful model even now, extremely relevant for ministry in our own day. And so to sum up my argument that he really is the father of modern missions, the methodology, his emphasis on the use of means, and when he talks about means, he's thinking about organizational means, because you just have to get organized. You have to get your act together. How do you send missionaries around the world? How do you support them? And it's not just something you can do on a wing and a prayer. A lot of prayer, but there needs to be organization behind it. And so that's what he did. He was brilliant at taking Andrew Fuller's theology, expanding it to the entire world, and then bringing it down to sort of a practical level. How do we get traction? How do we actually do this? And then he had this driving faith and courage that, okay, we will do it. Whatever it costs, we will move forward. And so if you think about William Carey, I think it's not unfair to put him on the same level as someone as Martin Luther, because you think about the Protestant Reformation, and of course, Luther and others were key to the gospel, that revival, the Reformation. But in the Reformation, what with the Catholic Counter Reformation, the fruits of the Reformation didn't extend any further than Northern Europe, the British Isles, parts of the British Isles, not all of the British Isles, and then the American colonies on the East Coast. And that was it until Carey's time. And it's only with Carey and his solving that dilemma of means that all of a sudden you have this massive expansion of the gospel around the world. Then you get the 19th century, which, some historians have called the Great Century because of that explosive growth. But it all comes out of Carey's initial ideas. After that, you have mission societies sprouting up everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so now Protestant Christianity, Reformed Christianity, or versions of it, evangelicalism, is a global religion. It was not a global religion before William Carey, and now it is. So to my mind, he really does deserve to be called the father of modern missions.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Why would you say Carey's mission work remains relevant and valuable for missions as we fast forward these, over 250 years later and are continuing on this missions work today?
I think it's absolutely relevant. There's so many things that have impressed me about it. We just came out last year with a book called A Commentary on the Serampore Form of Agreement. And one of the things that working through that, I edited that book it was a kind of a fun experience. There were scholars from all over the world, including India, who wrote chapters in that book. And we just took the different major points in that, the different articles in the Serampore Form of Agreement, and developed chapters on it. But when you look at the principles in the Serampore Form of Agreement, the inquiry kind of Carey's inquiry gives you an approach to how do you begin missions? How do you send missionaries overseas? The Serampore Form of Agreement really should be put side by side with it, because it's more about the philosophy on the field. How do you apply? How do you do gospel ministry on the foreign field? And so everything that's in both of those works is of absolute relevance to us today. In both of those things, one of the things that really strikes me is how they're extremely practical, but they're not pragmatic. What you see is this connection between serious theological contemplation and this movement from theology to practice. And so it's theologically driven missionary practice. And so you see that penetrating both the inquiry and the Serampore Form of Agreement. And nowadays, when we might have a tendency to drift to either one of those extremes, be extremely interested and careful of our theology, which is vital, but maybe struggle to say, okay, how do we then actually go about doing the ministry? Well, not that everything he did is something you would want to emulate. There are places that I think, they didn't think that through very well. Or there's some inconsistencies. Sometimes the relationship, for example, between how the mission functioned on the one hand and the authority of the local church, they were very careful. They were concerned about the autonomy of the local church, good ecclesiology, good practice in the church, but I don't think they had thought through all the implications of a body of missionaries, and how they function as a body of missionaries, and how they should respond to their local church. I don't think that means that we shouldn't pay attention to them. I think we can look at it, and we struggle with the same issues today. There's a lot of questions that once you get on the field, you've got to really work through. But that idea of moving from theology to actual obedience, practical obedience, I think is vital. Then there's so many things. His emphasis on prayer. I have a quote somewhere in my office where he talks about, that it's not going to be by might, nor by power, nor by the authority of the magistrate, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. And if that is the case, then we have to be very serious in prayer. And he was a man of prayer. His commitment to long-term service. He never returned to England. Ward returned at one time. Marshman returned. They actually went with a purpose that had to do with the mission, but he never did return to England. And so he went in 92, arrived in 93, and died in 34, I think it was. And in all those years, never returned to England. And so the idea of career service, not a long-term life service, I think that's better than even thinking in terms of a missionary career. It's you've given your entire life. And then they just understood immediately the importance of learning the language and learning the culture. And they were very serious about it. And how they handled culture, I think, is vital. And I think right now in missiological circles, there's a revival in certain circles that are kind of in the Reformed Baptist, the larger Reformed Baptist family. There's a real revival of interest and a beginning to think issues through. And but I think one of the things that we're still trying to figure out is what do you do with culture? Sometimes I hear the phrase sometimes that if you just get your ecclesiology right, that 90% of missions is just good ecclesiology. And I would say, sure, it's 90% of it's good ecclesiology, but I'd also say 90% of it is good missiology. And so there's this, you have to think through the missiological issues, and a lot of that is thinking through the culture. And so how do you balance healthy, biblical, historic Baptist ecclesiology, which we believe is biblical, which we see in the confession? How do you balance a healthy confessionalism, and how do you integrate that in a healthy way into various cultures?
Yeah, I think from my own um, experience and perspective, we rightly reacted to this neglect of ecclesiology, church government, that kind of became the norm through kind of the ecumenical movement and as it
Right.
spread through missions, where the drive was, reach all the nations with the gospel. But sometimes ecclesiology was dismissed as kind of colonial Western views, or even if not that, maybe divisive among evangelicals. And so there wasn't this focus on ecclesiology and church government. And you see that manifested in all kinds of ways in modern missions broadly today. And so you have this response, which I think is right, of no, ecclesiology is
Yes,
central. It's central to the carrying
absolutely.
out of the missions. But sometimes in the push for ecclesiology, not having a proper understanding of contextualization, or at least a focus on
Yeah.
what does this look like in another culture,
Yes,
is it
absolutely.
can lead to maybe an ecclesiology that doesn't rightly reflect the realities of a culture that somebody is ministering in, and seeking to plant faithful local churches.
Yeah. And so I think there's a genius in Baptist ecclesiology, the idea of the local church being independent and sovereign. And that produces a flexible structure that has you might say it has a certain weakness, which is what we talked about before. How do you organize for something that's a project that's larger than a local church? Well, but the answer's in the confession. It's associationalism,
Mm.
and so there's a genius to Baptist ecclesiology, um, and part of it is the independence of each congregation, the responsibility of each congregation for its own church life and for the evangelism of where it's at, and for being effective in its ministry to its place. So local churches are local. And so when you can build a church in an area that serves the body of Christ in that area, but also becomes a lighthouse for the gospel in that area, there's a genius to that. And one of the natural byproducts of that is the emphasis on raising up your leaders in your local context. And so I think that's one of the things that drives Carey's emphasis on raising up indigenous leadership. His big plan is not talked about much when you read your average biography of Carey, which will focus on, inspirational elements and, great, but they don't talk about his plan, which was the big plan that was driving him. Everything he was doing was to set up a network of local churches across Bengal. And his idea was to have missionaries spread out in a big network and have in each area a school. The school was important because they were translating the scriptures, but no one could read, so you had to teach them to read. So there was a gospel intentionality behind education, and then the idea of and then that was linked to a church, and through the school you were making contacts that would produce converts that then became the members of the church.
Mm.
And then the idea was that the national pastor was not supported by the mission. He was supported by that local congregation.
Mm.
And so there was an emphasis on training up national pastors that would be supported indigenously. And so they'd really thought through the whole issue of training, raising up, and how to deploy a network of national indigenous leaders. That, like I said, that was kind of lost in the next generation, but it's all very present in the Serampore form of agreement.
And you think
Uh,
in modern missions today how common that is, where you have a missionary goes to some other part of the world, preach the gospel by God's grace, are able to gather together converts to establish a local church, and then that missionary becomes the pastor of the church, understandably, given the newness of the church and the need for ongoing discipleship and training. But that missionary continues to be funded by the West, by Ascending Church specifically, and others. And you wind up in this scenario where the church has not developed a expectation of supporting local leaders. The challenge of that missionary transitioning leadership to indigenous leaders. I mean, all those are realities that come out of that approach. And I'm not saying I have easy answers to them, but you're saying this is nothing new. This is something that Carey and
No.
others have thought deeply
yeah,
about.
absolutely. It's the age-old problem. And well, for example, in Argentina, the Lord has blessed over the last 4 or 5 years, and we were able to begin an association, the ABRA, the Association. How do you say it in English? The Association of Reformed Baptist Churches in England, in Argentina. There it is. And there's 50 churches now across Argentina. A lot of them are small churches, but they've got their national pastors, and in many cases it's struggling ministries where the pastor has to work. And so the first reaction, this is somewhat controversial what I'm going to say, but the first reaction of a church is to say, well, we should underwrite that national pastor. And I do think that there's periods at which that might be an appropriate thing, especially if there's a phase where we say for 2 or 3 years, we're working alongside a church in Argentina to plant another church in Argentina. And we're going to help underwrite that ministry for a period of time. But a church that's just been there static for many years, well, then there's the sense of compassion for the pastor, and that's right. I understand that. But you don't necessarily help the church by saying, we'll underwrite your monthly budget, because that just creates, dependency. Or maybe even worse, it would be better to say, we'll support you as a church, and then from that, you can pay your pastor. Worse is when I think an American church says, we will just support your pastor. Well, that takes responsibility off of the church and creates an emotional distance between the church and their pastor. There's no longer that mutual dependency that's so healthy. And so one of the things I would like to advocate for is understanding that the churches here have, and in much of Latin America, and I think this is common in places around the world, if there was a way to help a church get its own facilities, its own building, then a cash-strapped church that now doesn't have to pay for monthly rent and then maybe they pay it forward. Maybe they're going to it's going to be a loan that they pay forward over many years, but it's going to go to help other churches in Argentina. And then the church can make a priority of paying for its own pastor. I think it's maybe a more healthy model, but it has, none of this is easy.
Right.
I don't have any magic fixes, but it's just, the point, I guess, in regards to Carey is that they were thinking in these terms, trying to think strategically and how to establish something. They were also thinking for the next generation. How do we establish something that continues to grow in a healthy manner long after we're gone? And I think that's very important as well.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much more we could say. Maybe with the few minutes we have left together, what would you say are a few ways Carey's influence has shaped your own growth as a missionary, both your life, your ministry?
Well, I think, first of all, that kind of, somewhere I don't see it. I should look for my props before we start. I've got the word plod somewhere. And just that idea of continuing to plod, that when they asked him, his nephew said, what's the secret of your success? He said, well, I've learned that in any endeavor I can plod. And that's what he did. He did for so many years before he ever went to the field, when he was trying to bring the brethren of the Northamptonshire Association around to the point of view that we could send missionaries. He just kept with it, very patiently kept working. And then once on the field, when things were very difficult, he just kept going. He never quit. That idea of constantly plodding. And I think the Lord, I'm not saying anything that many others haven't said, but the Lord rewards faithfulness much more. He's much more interested in faithfulness than brilliance. And so just that idea of faithful service year after year, that comes from a clarity maybe of calling and knowing that, a conviction that this is what God would have you to do and that this is what God is doing in the world. And over the years, you see fruit begin to accumulate. There becomes a point where it's not added. It becomes a multiplying factor. And if you live long enough to see that, that's a joyful thing. But it doesn't always happen. Some people just are faithful for an entire ministry and they never reach, it's always just addition. But that's good too, because God rewards faithfulness, not results. The results belong to Him. And so that idea, I think, has been important to me. The importance of really trying to think through the issues of culture has been an important thing. And then the idea of the use of means, thinking in terms of organizational means, especially here on the field. What are the auxiliary organizations that would be helpful to the churches? So we have an association of churches now, by God's grace. We started Carey Seminary a number of years ago.
You found a prop.
And found a prop. And yeah, and the seminary has grown, and now it's all over Latin America. And to me, it's kind of it's an amazing thing. We planted a seed in the ground years ago, and by God's grace, it's grown to something we never anticipated. And there's other things that all go to. We have a close relationship with Poema, and I think that's vital.
Yeah.
Poema is really one branch because we don't have to publish, we don't have to translate Bibles anymore. But it's still important to publish Bibles and important to publish good literature in Spanish. And thankfully, because of Poema and others, we have ever increasing theological resources. 15 years ago, we had almost nothing. And what the Lord has done over the last 10 or 15 years has been truly amazing. We also have a small publishing outfit here that's associated with the seminary, and we've been able to publish some things. So basically there's other things, but the point being that there's all these auxiliary organizations that sometimes feels like you're just juggling all the time. But part of that is that the other thing is teamwork, because I don't run all those things. The Lord has raised up a wonderful team of both missionaries. We have reaching and teaching missionaries working with us. And there's a couple more that are on their way, and then the national leaders that the Lord has raised up. He's a great team of elders, for example, in our church, the national pastors, the churches that we've planted immediately. There's 8 works that have come out of our original church, and the men who have faithfully led those now, in some cases 15 and 20 years, really are brothers in arms. And just that idea of teamwork, and nobody can do it alone.
Yeah, you mentioned...
Even the team doesn't do it either. The Lord does it. But.
You mentioned David Adams. Of course, he's another RBNet associated missionary there with Poema Publications.
Yes.
And thinking of Serampore, there were the trio that the Lord used
That's
together. Right. So even in terms of association or network, as you say, working together in different ways to further the mission and the gospel ministry and the planting of churches. What a blessing to hear some of the results of that. Well, before we go, any resources for those? I mean, we just touched the surface about things we could learn from William Carey. I mean, original resources, the Inquiry can still be read and found value in.
The Inquiry, I would recommend reading the Serampore Form of Agreement. If you read it, it is so relevant. It's almost, other than that the language is definitely from 200 years ago, most of the concepts, It talks about their Moravian community approach, which I think was a failure. That's a whole side discussion.
Right. The Moravians is a whole
But
other
other than that,
thing.
everything,
Yeah.
yeah. And so there is that book that came out, a commentary on the Serampore Form of Agreement, which if someone wants to dig in, there's a lot of resources. Somebody that wants to maybe do some research, that's a good place to start. There's a complete bibliography there. So that would be a good place for someone who wants to maybe go a little deeper.
Very, very helpful. Grateful for this, and as you think of how the Lord has used and continues to use Carey, his ministry, both in terms of insights and practices that we can learn from, as well as dangers for us to navigate and avoid. So much wisdom can be found. Grateful for your ongoing ministry and promotion of Carey, and hope that many that are listening or watching will benefit as well. So thank you, brother, for your
Amen.
ministry and your work.